They said the words so casually, like weather talk quando è solo. Oggi, when he's alone. Today. The phrase slipped through the air of Venice's most elegant hotel and landed in the ears of a 7-year-old girl no one ever noticed. But in less than 10 minutes, that same girl would burst into a conference room filled with billion-dollar suits and change a man's life forever. What she heard wasn't gossip. It was a plan to kill one of the richest men in America. Before we go further, think about this. Would you have believed a trembling child over your own security team? Leave your thoughts below, because this story proves that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one that saves it. And trust me, what happens next will shock you. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall arched windows of the Hotel Danieli, turning the marble floors into sheets of gold. The Grand Canal shimmered just beyond the terrace gondolas, gliding like black ribbons across the water. Inside, the air carried the scent of coffee perfume and quiet wealth. Everything in that place existed to remind people they were safe, important, untouchable. Ethan Marlowe believed that too. The self-made CEO of a global tech empire, he was the kind of man who made decisions that moved markets. Everything about him looked controlled. His movements, his tone, even the way he nodded at people who greeted him. He was in Venice for what his assistants called the Decade Deal, a multi-billion-dollar partnership that would anchor his dominance in Europe. To Ethan, it was another day of business. Predictable, profitable, safe. A few corridors away, hidden behind the scenes where the staff hurried between rooms, a little girl waited for her mother to finish work. Her name was Lila Bennett. Her sneakers were scuffed, her blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail, and her backpack sat on her knees like a secret she carried everywhere. Her mother cleaned the rooms for people like Ethan Marlowe, and on long days Lila waited quietly in the staff area, reading or doodling to pass the time. But that morning her world tilted. 2 men in hotel uniforms stood near the service door, speaking in low voices. Leila barely noticed them until she caught the rhythm of their words. Italian. Her grandmother, Nonna, had taught her enough to understand simple phrases, lullabies, and prayers. But this was not a song. The men weren't talking about rooms or guests. They were talking about a man. And one of them said that phrase again, quando è solo. Oggi, when he's alone. Today. Her heart froze. They said something about a key card, a service stairwell, a 10-minute window. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. They weren't real guards. They were waiting for a moment to strike. And the man they meant to hurt, she'd seen him on the cover of a magazine her mother had thrown away. The man in the blue suit, the cold eyes, the American. Ethan Marlowe. Every instinct told her to stay out of it. She was just a kid. No one would listen. But something inside her refused to be quiet. Maybe it was her Nonna's voice whispering, "If you can stop harm, you must." Maybe it was pure fear. She grabbed her red backpack and ran, past a waiter balancing champagne glasses, past the lobby's gold pillars and tourists snapping pictures. She found the right corridor, the one leading to the grand conference salon where the meeting was happening. Her shoes slipped on the polished floor as she pushed the heavy door open. A dozen men turned. One of them, tall and composed, looked up with mild irritation. "They're going to hurt you." The words tore through the room like a siren. Everyone froze. One of the Italian investors frowned. Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Who?" he asked, quietly. The guards, Lila gasped. They said, "Quando è solo, oggi." They copied a keycard. "They're coming." Someone chuckled nervously. "Security, please escort." Ethan lifted his hand. "Wait?" His voice was calm, but his eyes had sharpened. He knew the tone of deceit. It had built his fortune. The child's fear didn't sound rehearsed. Then the door opened again. A man in uniform stepped inside. The badge was right, the walk was right, but his expression wasn't. Too focused, too ready. Ethan's body moved before his brain caught up. He stepped between the girl and the door. "Where's Marco?" he demanded, referring to his head of security. "On his way, sir," the assistant stammered. The uniformed man smiled politely. "Everything is fine, Mr. Marlowe. Please come with me." The girl shook her head, eyes wide. "That's one of them." The room shifted from confusion to silence so deep it hummed. The man's hand twitched near his belt. Ethan caught it. He grabbed the imposter's wrist, slamming it against the table, sending papers flying. The other supposed guard appeared at the back door, but within seconds real security flooded the room, their Italian commands slicing through the chaos. The imposters were restrained, their badges stripped away, their earpieces fake. Lila stood shaking her small frame, dwarfed by the chaos she had just stopped. Ethan turned to her, disbelief in his eyes. "How did you know?" She blinked back tears. "They were speaking Italian. My nonna taught me. I heard them say they'd hurt you when you're alone." The room was spinning with noise, radios, orders, shocked voices, but Ethan barely heard it. He crouched down to her level, this billionaire whose time was measured in seconds, and said quietly, "You saved my life." The moment hung in the air like a photograph that would never fade. Outside, gondolas drifted on the canal, oblivious to the crisis that had just passed. Inside, the most powerful man in the room was no longer untouchable. He'd been saved not by money, not by security, but by a child who shouldn't have been there at all. And as the police took the imposters away and reporters began to swarm, Ethan Marlowe couldn't shake the question echoing through his mind. Why was she even here? Because sometimes fate hides miracles in the people the world refuses to see. That day, in the gold-lit halls of Venice, a little girl had rewritten the story of a man who thought he had nothing left to learn. The chaos in the Danieli faded by nightfall, but Ethan Marlowe's world didn't return to normal. Not really. The men who'd tried to kill him were in custody, the security breach was contained, and his legal team worked overtime to keep the story out of the headlines. Yet, even as his people called it a non-event, Ethan knew better. He'd seen the look in that child's eyes, the clarity of someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That kind of honesty doesn't come often in his world. The morning after, the board gathered in Milan for an emergency call. Half of them were furious about the canceled investor meeting. The other half worried about the optics. "You can't let this get out," one of them warned. "Our partners will question our risk management. The stock will take a hit." Ethan listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. Then one of the directors asked, "Why did you even stop the meeting for a child?" He looked straight at the camera, his voice calm but sharp. "Because she was right." The silence that followed was heavier than anger. He could almost hear their disbelief through the screen. For them, power meant never admitting vulnerability. But Ethan had spent his life surrounded by men who smiled while they plotted, and he had learned one truth: money buys protection, not intuition. That little girl's warning had saved his life. And now, against every instinct he'd built, he found himself wanting to know who she was. That evening, while the press still speculated about an attempted security breach, Ethan walked back through the service corridor of the hotel. It felt smaller now, tight, unpolished human. A manager trailed behind him nervously, offering explanations about new security protocols. Ethan barely heard him. He stopped near the bench where the girl had sat the day before. It was empty, except for a forgotten pencil and a folded piece of paper, a child's drawing of a building by the water. Crayon colors spilled across the page, bright and wild. He asked the concierge, "Where's the girl from yesterday?" The man hesitated as if unsure he'd heard right. "The little one. She's the daughter of one of our maids, Signora Bennett." She left after the police finished their questions. Very polite child, very brave. Do you know where they live? Ethan asked. The concierge blinked, startled by the question. On the mainland, sir, Maestri, I believe. But sir, that area is not, I'll manage, Ethan interrupted. Hours later, his car pulled into a narrow street lined with worn buildings that leaned toward each other like tired old men. The contrast from his world was jarring, the kind of poverty people in boardrooms talk about only in reports. He found the right door by the faint sound of a cough echoing from the stairwell. Margaret Bennett opened it. She was thinner than he expected, her face drawn, but kind. When she saw him, her breath caught. Mr. Marlowe, she said, her voice hesitant. My daughter told me what happened. I'm so sorry she interrupted your meeting. She saved my life, Ethan replied simply. Lila appeared from behind her mother's legs, clutching that same red backpack. She looked smaller now, without the bright hotel lights, her courage dimmed by exhaustion. Ethan crouched to her level. You were brave yesterday, he said softly. You listened when no one else did. She shrugged, eyes down. Nona always said to listen more than you talk. He smiled faintly. She raised you well. They invited him in. The apartment was small, 2 rooms clean but sparse. A single lamp cast a warm light over the table, where unpaid bills lay neatly stacked. The mother tried to make coffee with trembling hands. Ethan noticed the fatigue in her movements, the way she stifled another cough. You work at the Danieli, he said gently. Almost 10 years, she replied. The hours are long, but it's steady work. Lila waits for me there after school. I thought she was reading in the break room, not saving millionaires. Her attempt at humor broke into a dry laugh. Ethan stayed quiet, scanning the modest space, the single bed they probably shared, the drawing taped to the wall of a house with 3 stick figures, a woman, a child, and a man with broad shoulders. For a moment, he didn't feel like a CEO at all. He felt like a man who'd been blind for too long. When he left that night, the sound of Lila's laughter followed him down the stairwell, soft and fleeting. In the car, his phone buzzed with messages from his PR team demanding statements, investors pushing for reassurance. But his thoughts stayed on the child who saw danger when trained guards didn't. The following week was brutal. The media found the story, twisting it into speculation. American CEO saved by little girl in Venice. Every outlet ran its own version. Some painted him as reckless. Others accused him of fabricating it for sympathy. Stock prices dipped. His communications director called it a temporary reaction. But Ethan could see the doubt behind her eyes. In a board meeting, one of the older directors snapped, "You let a child into a restricted conference room. Do you understand how insane that sounds?" Ethan leaned forward. "Would you rather I died?" No one answered. He fired the head of security that day, not in anger, but in quiet disappointment. Then he ordered a full audit of every hotel and office under his company's name. For the first time, his focus wasn't profit margins, it was people, real people, the invisible ones who made the world run while men like him took credit. Late one night, he sat by the window of his suite, the Venetian lights reflected in the canal below. He replayed Lila's trembling voice in his head. "They're going to hurt you." The words still echoed, but now they carried a different weight. It wasn't just about the danger, it was about the courage it took to speak up when no one would listen. He called his assistant the next morning. "Find out what hospital treats employees from the Danieli," he said. "Mrs. Bennett needs a checkup." Quietly, "Make sure it's handled." The assistant hesitated. "Should I file it under corporate expense?" "No," Ethan said. "File it under decency." In the weeks that followed, he couldn't explain the pull he felt toward that family. Maybe it was guilt knowing that the hotel where he'd been nearly killed was also where a child spent her days waiting for a mother who worked herself sick. Or maybe it was gratitude, the kind that doesn't fade with headlines. For a man who had always defined himself by control, Ethan found himself driven by something unfamiliar: empathy. It cost him time, reputation, and a few sleepless nights, but the cost of not believing he realized would have been far greater. Because somewhere between the boardrooms of Milan and the narrow streets of Mestre, he discovered a truth that no profit could replace: that sometimes the most important investments are the ones that can't be measured in numbers. And though he didn't know it yet, the decision to believe that little girl would soon lead him into a fight far more personal than any deal he'd ever made. Ethan Marlowe didn't plan to see the Bennetts again. He told himself the danger was over, that gratitude could be expressed with a letter, maybe a trust fund in the girl's name, something efficient and distant. But 2 weeks later, as his car passed through the gray sprawl of Mestre, he found himself glancing toward the block where they lived. He told his driver to stop. Margaret Bennett opened the door, looking weaker than he remembered. The cough he'd noticed before had worsened. Her voice rasped as she greeted him. Lila was sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring on the back of an old receipt. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit with surprise, then something gentler like recognition. "Mr. Marlowe." Margaret said softly, embarrassed by the smallness of the apartment. "You didn't have to come." "Maybe not," he said, stepping inside, "but I wanted to." The place was spotless but sparse. A pot simmered on the stove half empty. A small electric heater buzzed in the corner. The red backpack hung on a chair like a piece of her childhood trying to stay bright in a dim room. Lila handed him a folded paper. "I drew this for you," she said. On it, the Grand Canal glowed under a yellow crayon sun. There was a boat, a bridge, and 2 stick figures, one tall one, small, standing side by side. Ethan studied the drawing longer than he meant to. "You remembered the bridge," he said, and she smiled proudly. Margaret coughed again and sat down, pressing a hand to her chest. Ethan noticed the tremor in her fingers. "Have you seen a doctor?" he asked. "They're expensive," she said simply. "It's just fatigue." He didn't argue. "I'll have my office arrange something." Quietly, she started to protest, but he stopped her. "Don't think of it as charity. Think of it as gratitude. You raised a child who saved my life." The silence that followed was soft, heavy. Gratitude and shame share the same silence sometimes. As weeks passed, Ethan visited more often. At first it was businesslike, checking that the medical appointments were kept, that Lila had what she needed for school. But the visits changed. He began staying for dinner. Sometimes they watched old Italian films on the tiny TV, while Lila translated bits of dialogue for him, laughing at his attempts to mimic the accent. He hadn't laughed that easily in years. At his office, people noticed. His schedule shifted. Late-night meetings disappeared. Investors complained about delays, and his assistant started whispering that he was distracted. They didn't know that the man who once measured time in dollars was now learning to measure it in conversations and shared meals. One afternoon he found Lila waiting for him in the lobby of his Venetian office building. She held the red backpack close, her eyes wide with worry. "Mom's not feeling good," she said. He canceled his meetings without hesitation and drove her home himself. Margaret was lying on the couch, pale, struggling to breathe. The doctor he'd hired arrived minutes later. Ethan waited in the hallway while Lila sat clutching her mother's hand. When the doctor finally came out, his face said what words didn't. "She needs rest," the doctor told Ethan quietly, "and ongoing treatment. But her body is very weak." Ethan nodded, though the words hit like a physical weight. He walked back inside and found Lila sitting on the floor beside her mother. Her eyes were dry, but her small hands trembled. He sat next to her, unsure what to say. For the first time in his life, money felt useless. A week later, he returned with groceries, blankets, medicine, and a small envelope. Margaret refused the money, but she let him leave the food. He stayed long after Lila had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table while Margaret spoke quietly. She told him about her late husband, about raising a child alone in a city that didn't care much for the poor. She spoke without bitterness, only tired honesty. "She deserves a better chance," Margaret said, voice breaking. "She's smart, curious. She just needs someone to see her." "She has you," Ethan said. Margaret smiled sadly. "Not for long, I think." Something in her tone scared him more than any boardroom crisis ever had. "Don't talk like that. I just need to know," she whispered, "that she won't be alone when I can't be here." He didn't answer right away. There were no lawyers, no contracts to make this promise binding. Just two people who understood that time was running out. Finally, he said, "She won't be, I swear it." Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. After that night, Ethan acted as if the promise were already real. He brought books for Lila, helped her with homework, even took her on short walks through the city when Margaret needed rest. They stopped for gelato once, and Lila asked, "Do you have a daughter?" He hesitated. "No, I never thought I'd be good at that." She smiled shyly. "You're good at helping Mom." The simplicity of her words undid him. In his world, deals were secured by signatures and sealed by profit. But this, the fragile trust of a child in her dying mother, was something sacred, unspoken, and terrifying. When he flew to London for a brief investor meeting, he called them every night. Margaret's voice grew fainter each time. The last call came just after midnight. She asked him if he remembered the drawing Lila made. "Keep it," she said. "So she knows she was never just another face in your world." He promised. On the flight back, Ethan stared out the window, the city lights below blurring into lines of gold. For the first time, he realized how fragile everything he'd built truly was. Power could vanish overnight. Fortunes could fall with a market crash. But a promise that was something that could outlast him if he kept it. When he landed, he didn't go to his office. He went straight to the Bennett's apartment. Lila opened the door, her face lighting up. "Mom's asleep," she whispered. Ethan smiled, but his chest tightened with dread. He looked toward the small couch where Margaret rested and whispered back, "That's okay. I'll stay a while." He sat in silence as the night deepened, watching Lila draw under the faint glow of the lamp. Her crayons scratched softly against the paper, steady and sure. He realized she was sketching three figures again, her mother, and him. In that quiet room, Ethan Marlowe understood something he'd never allowed himself to before. Love wasn't an emotion to control. It was a promise you kept even when no one was watching. And though the world outside still measured him by numbers in that moment, he knew he'd made the only investment that truly mattered. The day Margaret Bennett slipped away was quiet, the kind of quiet that swallows sound. Ethan Marlowe sat beside her bed, his hand resting on the blanket as she took shallow breaths that barely stirred the air. Lila sat on the other side, reading from a worn children's book, her small voice trembling but steady. When the last page turned, Margaret looked at her daughter with a faint smile, then shifted her gaze to Ethan. Her lips moved the words little more than a whisper. "Promise me," she said. And he did. When the breath left her, the world seemed to pause. Lila's cry broke the silence, a sound no child should ever have to make. Ethan pulled her close, holding her, until her small body stopped shaking. He didn't try to speak. Words would have been too small for what had just been lost. The days after were a blur of arrangements, paperwork, condolences from strangers who said all the right things but none of the right ways. Ethan handled it all. He organized the funeral, covered every cost, made sure Margaret was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery overlooking the water. He stood beside Lila as she clutched a small bouquet of daisies, her face pale and still. When it was over, she didn't let go of his hand. Back in Venice, the world didn't stop for their grief. Headlines hit the press: billionaire CEO linked to maid's family after tragedy. Cameras waited outside his hotel, hungry for scandal. Some suggested the story was a publicity stunt, others whispered darker theories. Ethan ignored them all. He had promised Margaret that Lila would never be alone. That promise was louder than every lie the world could tell. Then the government got involved. Social services came with polite voices and cold eyes. They told him procedure had to be followed, that Lila couldn't simply live with him, that the state would decide what was best. Ethan listened, his jaw tight. "You'll have to file for guardianship," one of them said. "There will be interviews, home studies, background checks. Until then, the child will be placed temporarily with a foster family." "No," he said quietly. "She stays with me." "Mr. Marlowe," the woman replied. "You can't, I can," he interrupted, "and I will." The legal battle began almost overnight. His attorneys filed the paperwork. The media swarmed again, calling him the billionaire fighting for a maid's daughter. Some praised him. Others accused him of playing hero. But for once, Ethan didn't care about perception. He wasn't saving a reputation. He was keeping a promise. He transformed his world to fit hers. The penthouse in New York, once silent and sterile, filled with traces of a child's life. Books on the couch, drawings taped to the refrigerator, a red backpack hanging by the door. For the first time, the place felt alive. He hired tutors, child psychologists, anyone who could help Lila navigate her grief. But the one thing she needed most was consistency, and that he could give. Every morning he made her breakfast badly, at first burnt toast, cold eggs, but she ate it anyway. She started calling him Mr. Ethan at home, though occasionally, in half-sleep, she said Dad and quickly corrected herself. Each time it cracked something open inside him. In court, he faced questions meant to test his motives. "Why do you want to adopt this child, Mr. Marlowe?" one judge asked. Ethan paused before answering. "Because she saved my life, and because she deserves one." The hearings stretched for months. Social workers visited his home, observed their routines, talked to teachers, neighbors, doctors. They saw the way Lila's hand instinctively reached for his, the way his tone softened when he spoke to her. Bit by bit, the reports turned in his favor. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in, when he stood by her bedroom door and wondered if he was good enough to raise her, to fill the space Margaret left behind. But then she'd look up from her drawing and smile at him with those same clear eyes that once cut through a room full of powerful men. And he'd remember this wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. Months later, the final ruling came. The judge read the decision in a quiet courtroom, her voice steady. "The petition for guardianship is approved. Ethan Marlowe is granted full custody of Lila Bennett." The words landed like an exhale he'd been holding for too long. Lila squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears. "Does that mean we're really family now?" she asked. He nodded. "We always were." Outside, reporters shouted questions. Ethan didn't stop for them. He walked past the cameras, past the noise, holding Lila's hand as they stepped into the sunlight. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking toward a deal, a headline, or a boardroom. He was walking home. That night, as the city lights glittered beyond their windows, Lila asked to release a balloon for her mother. Ethan helped her tie a note to it. It drifted up into the dark, carrying words only heaven would read, "We kept your promise." And when she leaned against him, quiet and safe, Ethan realized that all the wealth he had built had never bought him what he had now, something unshakable, something real, A family. Ethan Marlowe used to measure success in numbers, profit margins, market shares, square footage of glass towers that scraped the sky. But now, years after the day a little girl changed everything. He measured it in smaller, quieter things. The sound of laughter echoing down a hallway. The sight of a pair of sneakers left by the door. The peace of knowing that for once in his life what he built could not be bought or sold. Lila Bennett Marlowe was 12 now, all curiosity and confidence, her once quiet eyes alive with color. She had her mother's compassion and a courage that belonged entirely to her. Ethan saw both every time she sat across the dinner table telling stories about school or arguing that pizza counted as a vegetable. She didn't remember the hotel the way he did, the fear, the chaos, but she remembered her mother's voice, and sometimes that was enough to bring tears she tried to hide. Ethan never pushed her to talk. Instead, he kept his promise she would never be alone again. Their life had found a rhythm that surprised him. Mornings started with pancakes and arguments over whose turn it was to walk the dog. Evenings ended with books and soft light spilling from her room as she fell asleep mid-sentence. In between, there were the ordinary details that make up an extraordinary kind of love science projects spread across marble counters, crayons left on executive paperwork, a man learning to tie ponytails with more determination than skill. At work, the man once feared for his cold precision now led with a warmth that unsettled his competitors. Marlowe Global was still powerful, but it was different humane. He created scholarships for children of hotel staff, health care funds for single parents, mentorship programs for employees who'd once been invisible in boardroom statistics. When asked why, he always said the same thing, because I was blind for too long. His board grumbled about costs, but the company flourished. And for the first time, Ethan realized that decency could be a form of strength. He founded the Bennett Foundation a year after the adoption was finalized. Its purpose was simple: to protect and empower children like Lila, the ones who lived in the shadows of the powerful, but never felt seen. The first center opened in Venice, not far from the hotel where their lives had collided. Lila had cut the ribbon herself, standing on tiptoe with the same red backpack slung over her shoulder. Cameras flashed, reporters called her the girl who saved a billionaire, but Ethan leaned down and whispered, "They've got it wrong. You saved a man who forgot what life was for." She laughed and squeezed his hand, and in that moment he knew the empire he'd built before meant nothing. Yet even peace had its challenges. The world never stopped testing him. Investors questioned his softened image. Some journalists called his transformation an elaborate PR redemption arc. Ethan didn't bother correcting them. People always looked for strategy where there was simply truth. He no longer needed to defend himself. He had nothing left to prove. What mattered was coming home each night to a place that didn't care about headlines. He kept a photo of Margaret Bennett on his desk, a reminder of the woman whose strength had anchored 2 lives. Some nights, when the city outside was too loud, he'd glance at her picture and think about the promise he'd made that her daughter would be safe, loved, seen. It wasn't guilt that drove him anymore. It was gratitude. Margaret had given him a second chance at being human. On Lila's 13th birthday, they returned to Venice. She wanted to see the canals again, to visit the grave where daisies always grew no matter the season. They stood side by side in the quiet sunlight spilling through the cypress trees. Lila knelt to replace the flowers and whispered, "We're okay, Mom." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, resting a hand on her shoulder. "She'd be proud of you," he said softly. Lila looked up at him, her eyes clear. "She'd be proud of you, too." That evening, they watched the sunset from the terrace of the Hotel Danieli, the same place where fear had once ruled his life. The marble gleamed gold, the city below alive with music and water. Lila leaned against him and said, "Do you think people ever really change?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Only if something or someone gives them a reason to." She nodded, thoughtful. "Then I guess we both changed each other." He looked out over the city, the same skyline that once symbolized everything he thought mattered. "Yeah," he said. "I think we did." When they returned to New York, life slipped easily back into its rhythm. Ethan still ran one of the largest companies in the world, but now his empire looked nothing like the one he had built before. It was quieter, more grounded, made of people who believed in second chances. His success was no longer measured in skyscrapers, but in lives changed, one child, one family, one story at a time. Some nights, when the world outside glittered with the cold light of ambition, Ethan would walk into Lila's room and watch her sleep. Her drawings were still taped to the wall, some childish, some detailed, all filled with color. The newest one showed two figures holding hands beneath a skyline, not of towers but of homes, trees, schools, and people. A different kind of empire. Ethan smiled, turned off the light, and stood in the doorway for a moment, letting gratitude settle like peace in his chest. The man who once believed control was power had learned that love was stronger. The empire he'd built in steel might one day crumble, but this one, the one built from promises kept and lives intertwined, would last long after his name faded from the glass, and that he thought was the only legacy worth leaving behind. Ethan Marlowe's journey began with power and ended with purpose. He was once a man who believed that success could be counted in buildings and profits in headlines. But all of that changed the day a frightened little girl stood in a golden hotel lobby and warned him of danger. In that single moment, the walls of control and ego he had built around himself began to crack. The ruthless CEO who commanded empires suddenly found himself face to face with innocence, bravery, and a truth he had long forgotten, that life's real worth is found not in what you own, but in who you protect. Lila Bennett entered his world by accident, but she stayed because of choice. Their shared courage, their quiet promise, and the bond that grew between two souls from different worlds. She saved his life once, but in time he saved hers over and over again. Through her, Ethan rediscovered the humanity he'd lost chasing perfection. He learned that compassion isn't weakness, and love isn't a distraction. It's what gives every victory meaning. From the cold boardrooms of Venice to the warm laughter that later filled his New York home, Ethan transformed not just as a man, but as a human being. When Margaret Bennett, Lila's mother, took her final breath, Ethan's promise to her reshaped his destiny. He became not just a guardian, but a father. And through that promise he found redemption. The man who had once built towers for prestige began building foundations for people, centers for working families, scholarships for children, safe places for those the world overlooked. His empire didn't shrink, it evolved. No longer made of glass and steel, it was built from something stronger: empathy, gratitude, and love. Ethan's story reminds us that real strength isn't about control, it's about care. We live in a world that often celebrates ambition and overlooks kindness. But what if we measured success differently? What if we asked not, "How much did you earn?" but "Who did you lift up?" You don't need to be a millionaire to make an impact. Sometimes being present, listening, or choosing courage over comfort is what truly changes lives. So when you think of Ethan and Lila, remember this: our greatest legacies aren't built on wealth, but on compassion. It takes one act of courage to save a life, and one act of kindness to change one. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that goodness still has power, please subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling stories that touch hearts, inspire hope, and remind us all of the extraordinary power of ordinary love. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.